Hello and welcome to the Cubs on Deck podcast. I am one of your hosts. My name is Greg Huss, and today I am joined by a new guest co-host. This is someone we have not yet had on the show before. I'm pleased to welcome Aram Leighton from justbaseball.com. Aram, how's it going, man?
Doing well, man. Definitely excited to talk Cubs prospects, and I've interacted with you for so long. I'm excited to just chop it up with you.
I know. I'm really excited to have you on. I'm really excited. I kind of teased it on last week's episode. I'm excited to get somebody new on that has kind of a different perspective. I know that we've had on this show, as far as the rotating cast of co-hosts, having me with Brian and Greg Zumak on the show is always super valuable. Getting all the broadcasters on, they bring a very unique perspective. But something that I've loved to do with this new podcast with Cubs on Deck is get different varying perspectives. And I think the fans, the listeners out there have enjoyed that. I hope you guys have. But Aram, man, it's awesome to have somebody from Just Baseball that you guys cover everything having to do with baseball, obviously, but you specifically have a really good interest in prospects across the league. But I guess that I want to lead off with that. We got plenty on the docket here today. We're going to cover some individual players, but also the system as a whole. But I guess can you give a breakdown on your background, Aram, and how you got here to where you are today?
Yeah. So, I went to Syracuse doing, the broadcasting route and, was ready to kind of go down the play-by-play pipeline and do that climb through the minor leagues. And, my first broadcasting gig when I was still in school was on the Cape Cod League. And I think that's really where I first got that passion for the development process and what goes into that. And I was really lucky. The Katuitt Kettleers, a team that, I called games for, was absolutely loaded. It had Matt Mervis, Casey Schmidt, Nick Gonzalez, and that's just naming a few. There was probably 10 guys that got drafted in the first 5 rounds. And so watching that high quality of talent, seeing the scouts coming around, talking to them, and just seeing what goes into these guys' work and then following them back after they go to college and then the draft, I just became infatuated with the process. So while I graduated into COVID and unfortunately the minor league season was canceled, so my play-by-play job disappeared before it ever really started, I just kind of got going with Just Baseball and was doing it for fun, almost more to keep myself sane. Had some friends jump aboard. Never thought it would take off to the way it has today. And now it's a full-time thing, as we were talking about before we recorded. So, from the Just Baseball standpoint, really lucky to have people jump aboard that have, helped us really, take this thing to the next level and turn it into what it is. But from the prospect standpoint, I think the Cape Cod League is where I got to put a lot of credit into it. And then, just becoming friends with a lot of these guys and following them on their journey really just got me so bought into the process and, wanting to evaluate the next wave of talent, and started doing the prospect podcast, and it just kept going from there.
Yeah, so you've got the call-up show on YouTube and everywhere where you listen to podcasts. But you bring up a good point that it's interesting to me that like baseball is so much different than all other sports when it comes to like player development. You know what I mean? Like you don't see these like robust player development systems in the NBA and in the NFL and stuff like that. It makes this coverage so interesting and so much fun.
And 100%. And I had this just desire to almost unearth that next up and coming player or find that guy that was slipping through the cracks and, just be able to see how scouts and evaluators are able to do what they do and, how they're right, how they're wrong, and everything in between. And, you look at Matt Mervis, for example, and I know we'll talk about him and these other Cubs prospects, but I think Mervis is a perfect example. I watch that guy every single day on the Cape, and that's a big reason why I'm so high on him. Is not because I watch him so much. Like maybe there's a little bit of bias in there, but on the other side of it, it's also like, look at his numbers. I watch that guy absolutely hit, but for whatever reason, for the buckets that we put scouts in, Mervis flew right under the radar. College, he didn't get consistent opportunities. There's a lot of factors that go into things, and that was one of the cases of the many that I looked at while being on the Cape, where I'm like, man, how did that guy fly under the radar? And then why was this guy, so highly touted? Are they not watching? Like, and there were just so many different things that stood out to me. And I'm like, this process is just so different than, like you said, like than any other sport that you're looking at. And no two development processes are the same, which is so cool.
Yeah, I'll throw one more compliment your way before we get into players. Partially to actually give you some love, partially to give some credibility going into the rest of the show. But I think that you bring like a really unique mix of like the scouting hat and then like the analytic part of the game, which is so important in today's game. You know what I mean? Like I think that like some of the best evaluators of talent in the minor league system, like they're taking into account like these exit velos and the spin rates of pitchers and stuff like that. Some of like the under the hood stuff, but also like the eye test. Like the eye test is huge. You can combine those two elements, and like that's how you properly evaluate talent these days. You know what I mean?
Oh, I really appreciate that, man, because honestly, that's what I try to do. And if you like see the prospect write-ups, like I always try to start it with the mechanics of their swing, you know, what they do, their moves in the box, or you know, mechanics of their delivery, and then explain, you know, how that kind of coincides with the data. And you know, sometimes it doesn't always overlap, and sometimes you have guys that like they're a little bit of you're like, oh wow, that doesn't totally add up. That swing doesn't look like it would produce this. But a lot of the time, you look at a guy that, you know, has end zone whiff issues, and then you look at the swing and you see some inefficiencies, you see some length, and it all kind of paints a complete picture. So I think each is a piece to the puzzle, and it puts it all together to complete it. And I think it really helps now when you have those kinds of numbers and that information.
All right, brother. Let's get into some players here. You mentioned Matt Mervis. He was a guy that you watched on the Cape, and you are a guy that has had him in the top 100 prospects heading into this year, right? So yep. You are higher on him than I think just about any outlet out there. I think when I first reached out to you to come on the show, I think that Matt had not made his debut yet. He hadn't been called up. And so I had this bullet point on the agenda is like, let's go on a rant about why Matt Mervis is not up yet. I figured you'd take advantage of that. But now we're sitting here and Matt Mervis is in Chicago. You want to talk about why you love Matt Mervis, the player, and I guess the person to a certain degree, and why you think that he could be something really special at first base for the Cubs.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And there's two Cubs guys, so I'm excited that I feel like I just baseball we are definitely higher on than maybe anybody else in the industry, which is always really fun. But you know, with Matt, there's a combination of a lot of things. So you talk about the eye test. I mean, the swing is really powerful. He packs a punch. He hits the ball really hard. But the way he got better at each level last year, you know, the way that we saw him continue to figure himself out as a hitter, kind of learn more about himself, and to see your strikeout rate drop at each level, to see basically every offensive category go up. That shows me that's a guy that's just continuing to gather information and apply it. And that's who he is, right? He went to Duke. He's a really smart guy. And he's always very meticulous with his preparation. And this is somebody that I just feel like is always going to get better, and he is just a sponge. But when it comes to the data side of things, you know, the contact rates were well above average for a guy of his kind of power. You look at the exit velocities, really strong. Yes, he likes to go to his pull side, and he has a lot of confidence in his ability to pull pitches that are middle away into the air and over the wall. But he can use the whole field too. He's comfortable against lefties. It's pretty hard to poke a hole in his offensive approach. And for him, he's smart enough to where it's some areas where he knows he's not as strong, he's able to hedge that with his approach. So it's really hard to poke a hole in his offensive game. And I think we've seen that, you know, through the last season and a quarter, roughly. I could say season and a half if you include the fall league in the minor leagues. And now he's getting his feet under him in the big leagues.
I think that Brian Smith, fellow co-host of the show, has described it kind of perfectly as far as you mentioned that ability to pull the ball, but also use the whole field that you don't see that happen quite as much. And I think it's because, as Brian says, like he has a unique ability to make really good contact out front, right? Yep. That leads to, like, even though he's not, I mean, he is putting up pretty good exit velo numbers, but like that is something that, like, I mean, for Cubs fans, Anthony Rizzo was very good at that, right? Where he made the right contact in the right location. He's not putting up 115 consistently, even though Mervis has that ability to do that. But it's just that unique ability to contact the ball out front, and that leads to the ability to pull the ball. He can also wait on it and go to the opposite field, but like when you're that good at doing that, take advantage of it, you know?
Absolutely. And I think he's a very underrated athlete too, in terms of, like, he's a big dude. He's not fast, but he moves well and he knows his body well, and he's very mobile. this was a dude that was a pretty good pitcher, up to 95 on the mound. Saw him throw plenty on the Cape too, and he just moves well in the box, and that's important too. When you're able to control your body like that, you're able to do a little bit more in the box, and I think that's exactly what we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to be able to give you the opportunity to talk about him because I know that how high you've been on Matt throughout the last year, and I mean basically since he was he signed with the Cubs a few years back. So I love that. Let's go ahead and move on to a guy that you have ranked as coming into the season. You had him ranked number 1. I assume that is still the case now. Pete Crow-Armstrong is performing. He's having a very successful season at the plate and in the field. Obviously, it's a really weird and wonky season. But first, I want to talk about his outfield defense because I think that you mentioned on it was probably on the call up, I'd imagine, about his center field defense and how he's one of the best you've ever seen out there. I think right now you have a 70 future grade on his outfield defense. He's damn good out there, man. He's so good.
I really think he could be the best center fielder in Major League Baseball by the time, he really settles in there. Remember, he's 21 years old too. Missed the first full season of professional baseball for him. And, it's already where he's at defensively. You could plug him out there, and he's one of the guys that I wish so much we had outs above average in the minor leagues because I know the second you could plug him in the big leagues right now, and I promise he'd be in the top, several percent. And then you add in the fact that he has the arm that he has. It is so much like Michael Harris to me. And just being able to talk to him and asking him kind of what goes into his whole preparation, the way he kind of thinks about the outfield, the way he's been able to lean on some guys like Albert Almora in the past to help him. I believe I'm trying to remember who the other name he brought up was. It might have been Kevin Pillar. I don't want to misquote him there, but several very, very good big leaguers who he used as just a sponge to continue to, learn about the best ways to use his impressive skill set in the outfield. But you pair the jumps with the speed and just his awareness. He always knows where he's at on the field. And then he has this freak arm. There was a play he made the other day that the catch was sick, but honestly, it was the throw that he whipped in where I was like, oh my gosh, this guy could legitimately win several Gold Gloves. He could be one of those guys that is just might win it every single year, depending on, what the rest of the competition looks like. So I don't think I've really seen, in terms of the video and in person, I don't know if I've seen anybody like Pete Crow-Armstrong.
And that defense is what gives him an extraordinarily high floor as a prospect because you can fall back on damn good defense in center field that even if he doesn't hit at all, he's still a positive WAR player, even if he's an awful hitter. And he won't be an awful hitter. He's been very, very good this year. But something I want to talk about, we actually haven't talked about this part of PCA yet on this show. I think we've kind of let it play out to a certain degree, but I do want to bring it up now with you. Right now, PCA is not walking at all. Yeah. I think he walked more this past week than he had in the entire season combined, but he's got a really, really low walk rate. And that dates back to really last year, too. He was walking a little bit during his time in Myrtle Beach last year, and then he came up to South Bend and basically didn't walk at all his entire time in Tennessee, not walking at all. And, he's still making really strong contact, right? So he's not just speaking of Albert Almora, we talk about him a lot on the show in terms of player development. Albert Almora was a guy that made a lot of contact. He didn't walk hardly at all. He made a lot of contact, but his contact is weak, little dribblers over the third base and shortstop. You know what I mean? Versus PCA is making the more strong, the harder contact, better exit velo numbers. And he's driving the ball into the outfield way more than we ever expected him to do. How concerned are you with that lack of ability to draw walks right now?
It's funny too. I always want to compare to previous players, both on the successful side and, on the other side of things when, I'm looking at the data and looking at the numbers. And the big thing with Almora is he just, really struggled to get the ball in the air. You talk about the rollovers, and that's something that Pete Crow-Armstrong does not struggle with. Obviously, he gets the ball in the air with relative ease, and his 90th percentile exit velocity of 103 miles an hour, that's a full notch above average. It's pretty darn good, especially with how often he hits the ball in the air. So I think you're seeing a path to pretty solid power. The other thing that's interesting to me is that, he makes plenty of contact. The zone contact's pretty solid. He puts the ball in play. Another guy that uses the whole field pretty well, but the pull side, power is a little bit more impressive. It's just a really aggressive approach. 50 last year was a 57% swing rate, if I remember correctly. This year it's down about 1.5%, but that's still way too high. I think he's right at 55.5% in the swing rate department. And just for reference, like above 40% chase rate, it's really hard to walk if you're going to swing it, well, more than half the pitches you see and chase over 40% of pitches. But the thing is he's hitting. So how do you tell a guy that's hitting high 200s, low 300s to swing less? It's kind of hard to convince him that. I say the same thing about Elly De La Cruz because, he's always been so aggressive in a different way, but he hit 300 last year. It's like, how do you convince that guy to swing less? And, it's crazy because I figured maybe AA, that aggressive approach might bring him down to earth a little bit. And he's honestly been great. So it's hard. I do think he's going to always be one of those guys that just doesn't walk much. And if he's striking out 18% of the time, putting the ball in play consistently, again, it's hard to kind of tell him to change something. But that's the one thing I am wary about is like, as you get to more advanced pitching, is that something that can be exposed a little bit more? But so far, there really hasn't been an issue with it in terms of his production. So it's a really interesting conversation.
Did you just pull PCA's swing rate off the top of your head from last year without notes?
Yeah.
That's so nerdy. Numbers. Yeah, that's so nerdy. It's incredible,
dude. My co-hosts on the Just Baseball show make fun of me all the time because they'll like just randomly quiz me on random numbers like that. But especially with the prospects I like, and I love PCA, like that the numbers will stick in my head a little bit better.
I love it. I absolutely love that. All right, man. So you mentioned Matt Mervis is a guy that you guys at Just Baseball are extraordinarily high on. Another guy that I think you're kind of hinting at is Owen Caissie.
Yep.
And I'm really curious to hear your take on the Owen Caissie versus Kevin Alcantara kind of breakdown. I know that most places have Kevin Alcantara as a higher rated prospect than Owen Caissie. I think the logic there is that the athleticism kind of plays up with Kevin Alcantara. That the just the fact that he can play a really strong center field at this point. There's a lot to like about Kevin Alcantara, obviously.
Of course.
I think that I probably have him at this point as my number two prospect in the Cubs system. Owen Caissie is the same age as Kevin Alcantara.
Yep.
And he's up in AA. And he's although it's this is something we've documented a lot on the show. The year that Owen Caissie's having is very strange, right? Like in terms of like the numbers overall, very, very strong. The strikeout rate is still super, super high, but like he's doing that against competition that is literally 3 or 4 years older than him. So what's your take on the Owen Caissie versus Kevin Alcantara prospect kind of ranking here?
Yeah, so it's funny because I think we are the only ones to have Caissie ahead of Alcantara, and it's not by much. I think we got Caissie at 66 on our top 100 and Alcantara at 70. So we're not talking about, this major discrepancy. And I do think that the, athleticism and ability to play, all three outfield spots helps Alcantara a lot. But when I look at Caissie, I see, and I think we're really seeing it shine through now, plus raw power. And it has been more than evident so far this year. And he's hit some home runs that are just absolute rockets. So far this season, 90th percentile exit velocity is always a great indicator of power. Of course, 114 mile per hour, 90th percentile exit velocity. Like that is 100% the best in the organization. That's one of the best figures in the minor leagues. The strikeout rate's a little concerning. But honestly, like if we put him down at, and he's Kevin Alcantara's teammate and he's just lighting it up there to a 1,100 OPS, he'd probably be ranked higher. And I almost think that's backwards because he is being challenged. Like you said, older competition, AA. And I think the jump from high A to AA is as big as any. And then you take the high A to the Southern League jump right now with these taxed baseballs. And I think it's as big of a jump as you've maybe ever had in the minor leagues. Talking to guys, like they mention how hard it is to consistently hit right now in the Southern League because of how much more induced vertical break these fastballs have, because of how much, just sharper these breaking balls are, and how much more horizontal movement some of these changeups they see. Like you got to be so perfect all the time. And the thing that stands out to me with Caissie is if there's a ball over the middle, like he's not missing it. He's still getting his. The approach looks good. The power looks easy 70. his arm in the outfield is comical, and I do think that he's going to grow into a better athlete out there. He was very raw, obviously, when he first got acclimated there, and I talked to him in the Arizona Fall League, and he said one of the things he really wants to focus on is his footwork, his mobility, and agility. But we're seeing the power just turn into one of the most impressive power bats in the minors right now. If you look at exit velocities, if you look at game power, and the way that he's able to get into that pop by consistently hitting the ball in the air, this dude's got some of the best pop, I think, in the minors.
And it's worth pointing out that he's been challenged as far as the competition he's up against and the age at the level he's at each the past few years, right? So like he's in AA as a young kid now. He was challenged in high A last year. He was even challenged when he was brought up to Myrtle Beach at the tail end of 2021. So
yep.
He has consistently been challenged, which is something that like I think is a trend that you can follow with this Cubs development staff, right? If they trust a guy like Owen Caissie to continue to get this challenge, then they obviously see something really, really impressive in him as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's the approach that really shines through. This is a dude that, again, he's walking at a 13% clip. He doesn't expand the zone much, 25% chase rate roughly, and he hits lefties well and has continued to get better in that regard too. So when you have those things, like, sure, he's going to be somebody that swings and misses a fair amount, like even as he continues to cut this K rate down. But if you hit lefties well, if you hit for a ton of power and you walk, that hedges a lot of the swing and miss in my eyes. And I do think that the swing and miss is going to keep getting better. He's not even 21 yet. He can't legally buy a beer, and he's already putting up big power numbers in AA. I think that's an extremely good sign so far.
I mean, between Alcantara and Owen Caissie, they both get some extra points for having phenomenal hair, though.
Yes, absolutely. And they're both big dudes, man. They're both huge. But I will say, like, Alcantara, you can see what the potential is. But this is somebody that, I think has a lot of things he needs to iron out. Ground ball rate is really high. Chase rate's pretty high. Still seems like he's trying to figure himself out in the box with his moves and repeating those moves. And the lower half is a little bit inconsistent, which is super common for a young hitter, especially a young 6'6" hitter. And I think it's all going to come along. I just think that there's a wider range of outcomes. These are both very, very high variance prospects, but I do think like Alcantara is about as high variance as they come.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that one. We'll get back into some player specific things towards the end here. I want to get into what players may or may not be sliding up and down your rankings here, but I do want to pivot a little bit and get to one of the main reasons why I had you on here, right? Is I want to see in your eyes how this system as a whole kind of compares to the rest of the league, right? I mentioned to you before we started recording here that it feels like the fans of the Cubs system are really, really high on everything going on in the system. And I think part of that is because the organization is as strong now as they have been in several years, obviously. Also, very recently, the Major League Cubs have gone on a little bit of a slide. And so when that happens, naturally the focus turns to what is going on down in the farm. So I think it's important to bring that perspective of like, what does it look like from the outside, right? And I know that you have that experience in looking at the systems throughout all the league, but I guess from a very general point, before we dig in a little bit more, how do you view the Cubs system in comparison to a lot of the rest of the league here?
I think it's got to be top third, and better than that potentially. It's to me what they have done on the drafting side, on the development side, and some of these under the radar trades, and I don't think they're under the radar now, but I mean, to get Ben Brown for David Robertson, for a rental David Robertson, like that's crazy. I think some of the moves that they've been able to make have been really impressive, but with where Ben Brown's trending, and I think, Brown is a guy that, spoiler alert, will be on our top 100 prospect update. We had 19 guys graduate, as the season's gone on now. So we're going to update that in the coming weeks. It's just baseball, and Ben Brown will be on there. That's a testament to him. Like, he jumps over Cade Horton, and Cade Horton is a early first round pick, who's looked really good. He's looked as advertised. I still like Jordan Wicks a lot. He's still trying to find it all, but I still like him a lot. Wisniewski might technically be graduating, but that's a back end top 100 guy. We had 6 Cubs prospects in our top 100. That was among the most. So, for me, I think it's definitely, it drops off a little bit like a lot of systems do. But I think that we've seen with the recent draft, like Jackson Ferris, it looks fantastic. The way they've been able to draft, I think, has bolstered the system in terms of having depth. And then having somebody like Miguel Amaya bounce back and look really good. And just even for them to think enough and for him to show enough to be able to go up to the big leagues and hold it down in a pinch is a testament to him. This system just is, I think, is among the top 5, 6 in the league.
And you mentioned the word depth there a few times. And I think that's something that Cubs fans have grown really accustomed to, because there was that stretch there when the Cubs didn't necessarily have that top end talent, right? We kept hearing about the depth in the system, and that was completely that did exist and that was legit. But they were missing the top 30-ish guys in baseball.
Yeah.
How difficult is that for you? I'm not even necessarily asking you to compare that depth that the Cubs have to other teams, but like that's getting, talk about getting nerdy. Like that's getting super nerdy in terms of comparing depth. How difficult is that? I mean, because you're not necessarily comparing like the PCAs to the Ellie De La Cruzes. You're comparing like the guys ranked 10th in the system to another organization's 10th. So how, from just a writing perspective, a podcasting perspective, how difficult is that process?
No, it's a great question, man. And I think that's one where it's like, you got to really dig into it a little bit. And also like when it goes to the guys that, might be a little bit more under the radar that, I haven't seen as much of, that's where I will lean on, relationships with players and just ask, like who's someone that's standing out to you, like, in camp that, might not be getting enough fanfare. And, that's where I'll kind of get some ideas of who to look, a little bit more into, because I can't look at every single prospect in every system. Like this is where you guys are so good, because, and that's why I love following people like yourself, because you're going to be talking about BJ Murray, but like not a lot of people are going to be talking about him on a national scale. Right. Even a Jake Slaughter, like I love Jake Slaughter.
I was actually going to bring him up. Yeah.
I watched a couple games. I loved what I saw, but I was like, maybe I just saw a couple good games. And I don't think Mervis will care if I mention this. I texted Mervis. I was like, is Jake Slaughter good? And he said, yes. Thank you for asking this. Yes. I don't know why he doesn't get more attention, because he's old, like whatever it was. And like went on this whole rant about how Jake Slaughter is really good. So like, my point is like, there's so much talent across minor league baseball that there's always going to be guys that slip through the cracks. But that is where I try to separate myself and earn the trust of, other fan bases. Cause I feel like if I can help identify, or show some love to those deep prospects in the system, then hopefully some more Cubs fans will latch on and, appreciate what we're doing and what we're putting out. So I do feel like that's a big way to earn the trust of fans. And, that's the late night 1 a.m. stat dives and video dives that I'm doing. It's usually looking for those guys.
I think that Matt Mervis is not the only guy in this system that really believes in Jake Slaughter. I know that we had Cole Roeder on our show here. He mentioned Jake Slaughter as being a guy that we need to be talking about more. I think Jordan Wicks also mentioned on the show Jake Slaughter. Everybody that I've talked to is like, oh, Jake Slaughter's a guy. Jake Slaughter's a guy. So Mervis is not the only guy that's all about the Slaughter madness.
I love it. Did he hits and like another sneaky athlete? That guy can move. Like he can move a little bit.
He stole. I don't have the numbers up in front of me. He stole almost 30 bases last year. I'd imagine. He has speed to go with the power that he's shown in Iowa again. So
he just doesn't look like it. He's just one of those guys that just flies under the radar.
Yeah, he's a definite dirtbag, and I love that. Fans love that too. Fans love a player that plays like that. All right, so I mentioned that this Cubs team had depth for a while, but lacked that top end talent. And I think that I know we already talked about PCA, but like PCA is that top end talent, right? And you have a few other guys in Owen Caissie and Kevin Alcantara. Brendan Davis has kind of fallen out of that to a certain degree, but some of these pitchers, like the Cubs do have top end talent now, in addition to just having that depth.
100%. And I think, my criticism, for lack of a better word, of the system prior would have been the pitching. Like I loved the bats, especially being higher on Caissie and, being higher on Mervis. It's impossible to say I don't like the bats in the Cubs system, especially where Brennan was at, a year ago and where a lot of these guys were. And PCA was obviously still a very highly regarded prospect before he really, really turned himself into what he is. So I always liked the bats, but before they added Ben Brown, before they traded for Cade Horton, even Jordan Wicks started to get going, I did feel like, oof, okay, the pitching seems a little barren here. But with the way that they've drafted, with some of the arms that they've been able to get, I really do feel like that has helped make this a more well-rounded system. And then what I like is they've got that balance of big, high upside, high variance arms like Daniel Palencia, who throws it as hard as anybody, and I think has the floor of like a lights out back end guy, but they still want to keep trying him. And then you've got like those higher floor arms that could end up being that like swingman depth arm, like a Porter Hodge, who I just still love to watch pitch. He just gets out. It's like I think that they've done a really good job of just continuing to develop that talent and find that depth throughout the system now and create it. And again, like another high variance arm, like a DJ Hers, that you hope it all clicks and he could turn into something. But then you hedge that with like Luis Devers, who has a disgusting changeup that should allow him to climb, relatively quick compared to maybe some other guys with the lack of fastball quality. So yeah, I just think it's a really fun system now that hedges itself with all different types of prospects.
I think that listeners would be pissed off at me if I didn't mention the words pitch lab, because the pitch lab for the Cubs organization has become very polarizing, right? It's the word pitch lab is there for fans to prove and say, oh, the pitch lab doesn't work, the Cubs suck. It's also there for fans to say, it's okay, we can fall back on the pitch lab. It's just their excuse either way. And the funny thing is like the pitch lab is not like Todd Johnson over at Northside Bound has gone into detail about what the pitch lab is. It is not a standalone location, right? The pitch lab travels. The pitch lab is something that happens at every affiliate at every level. And not only that, but like this pitch lab, like that's something that every single team has. It's basically going in and figuring out what makes a player the best possible version of himself. Right. How does I guess my question is, how does the pitch lab as far as Cubs go, how does that pitching development compare to some of the other teams in the league?
I think they've come a long way, man. Like I think you got to look at a Ben Brown exactly, and even a Jordan Wicks exactly, and see the way that these guys couldn't be more different. And you kind of teased it there, right? Jordan Wicks and Ben Brown are as different as humanly possible, but continue to develop really well, because I think a pitch lab and the way that they approach it here, and I think what the whole purpose is like you said, to get the most out of whatever profile you have here. And for Wicks, that's going to look a lot different than Ben Brown. But what we're seeing is both these guys making some tweaks to their arsenal and continuing to get better. And I do really think that the Cubs are onto something here. And, it always is a little bit of like a rat race, and, teams are always trying to find the next big thing and that next edge. But when you look at the Cubs, I think they're doing a good job of identifying the types of arms that they feel like will, kind of integrate well. And then also just finding the high floor arms like the Jordan Wickses that they can continue to, tweak a little bit here and there, but already have a pretty good baseline. So I think it's hard to say that the Cubs aren't doing good things when you see the trajectory of Ben Brown. If the Phillies knew that Ben Brown was capable of this, they would have never traded him for a reliever for several months, right? Like they wouldn't. And I know it's Dave Dombrowski, but even he wouldn't have done that. You look at some of the younger guys in the starts that they've got off to. Like I do think that it's a testament to what they're doing here.
I feel like another thing with that is identifying what a pitcher's best pitch is.
Yep.
Saying throw that more,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then have pitches that help that really strong pitch play up. So Greg Zumack over at Northside Bound wrote an article about Jordan Wicks recently. And he identified Jordan Wicks' cutter as his quote unquote miracle pitch. And the reason why he called it that is that right now the slider is really impressive by some of the metrics. And the fastball is pretty good, but that cutter is kind of the bridge, right? It's the bridge between the fastball, the four-seam fastball, and the slider that makes each pitch better. And I think that that whole like explanation there is what makes like pitching development so important and so crazy in today's game of baseball. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And that's the thing too, is you got to kind of take it case by case, and having that kind of hands-on development process with the quote unquote pitching lab, I think really helps that. And I think what stands out to me too, you talk about the way that the cutters kind of factored in here. It just gives him a different look, because a lefty fastball changeup guy, like we see those fastball changeup guys when they're on, they're really tough to hit. But when one of those pitches isn't there, they don't have many other ways to get guys out. And so I think we're seeing a lot of different wrinkles to Wicks, and at 23, looks like he's starting to really find himself, which is awesome.
I tossed this out last episode. I want to get your take on it. The splitter as the next like sweeper, like the next like pitch that everybody's trying to adopt.
Oh yeah.
You about it?
Absolutely. I 100%. And I forget who, it might've been Alex Fast who recently put out, like the ex Woba or it was just Woba against by pitch in the big leagues. And obviously splitter is one of the lesser thrown offerings, given, how relatively difficult it is to throw, and not everybody can really do it. But it had the lowest Woba allowed. And, I think that for good reason. It's extremely hard to pick up, and a good splitter is disgusting. Talking to some guys across the minor leagues, like a lot of them are like, yeah, that's a pitch I want to figure out. That's a pitch I want to find. I do think that could be one that really takes over, and we're seeing more and more. And I think just even variations of changeups, like we're seeing Brent Honeywell survive off like a screwball now. So just kind of finding those unique pitches. But yeah, I do think the splitter is going to make some waves. I 100% agree with that.
I feel like the difference though is that the splitter is super difficult to throw versus sweeper. It feels more like anybody can kind of not anybody can. You have to have the right like supination versus pronation and stuff like that in order to throw it. But it seems like more guys are just able to pick that puppy up and say, all right, like time to throw a sweeper.
Yeah, it's more of just that adjustment of like, okay, I just have to, have it, whatever the tweak is. I can't pretend to really know what most of these guys have to adjust, but it seems like a lot of guys like wanted to add a sweeper and did. When it comes to the splitter, I'm sure a lot of guys have tried it and couldn't. I agree. I don't think that totally happens with the sweeper, and that's why we're seeing them kind of just take over the game. And again, like I do think that there's only certain guys that can really comfortably throw that splitter consistently for a strike.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's go ahead and transfer back to some kind of player specific type stuff. So looking back at your preseason Cubs top 10 list that you put out at justbaseball.com, it was a fun list that you put out, and I'm sure that since you put it out, actually let me go ahead and run through these top 10 guys that you had preseason, because I'm going to ask you a question about it moving forward. So you had a pretty normal top 2 at the time of PCA at 1, Brennan Davis at number 2, and then you had the guys we talked about, Owen Caissie and Kevin Alcantara at 3 and 4. Matt Mervis filled out the top 5 at number 5. And then you had a trio of pitchers of Wesneski, Wicks, and Cade Horton. And then Christian Hernandez and Ben Brown kind of wrapped up the top 10. It's been a wild first month or two of the season since you dropped this list.
Yeah.
What are the kind of the big movers and shakers in terms of guys that have fallen, guys that are now in consideration for this top 5 or top 10 on this list? Like, where's the big moves at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I was looking at this recently and just thinking like, oh wow, this is a really fluid system here. And Brown obviously is a guy that's gonna jump up several spots, especially with Wesneski graduating. I think he's someone that easily jumps Horton and he can slide right into that, like it might, and jumps Wicks and probably goes into that 5 or 6 spot. I think Brennan Davis is someone that's, as much as it pains me, because I love Brennan Davis, and I think a lot of his struggles are not related to his ability and more so just kind of just getting back to who he was and who, that explosive athlete, because I saw him in South Bend. I saw him in Double. Like they looked more explosive, looked different. So I feel like I'm gonna very reluctantly drop him, but realistically, like it's hard to justify Brennan maybe ahead of some of these guys, and that's something that's going to be a really interesting thought process as well. But I do want to give Brennan a little bit more time. It's been cold. He is not a cold weather kid, and he's coming off of that back injury. But I think that's a guy that you have to look at and say, okay, he's probably a mover a little bit too the other way. But for the most part, it's got to be probably Christian Hernandez as well. Like that's a guy that, man, I don't know what to do with him. I don't know how Cubs fans feel because he's 19 and he's still like he's closer to 19 than he is 20. But the swing looks so much better than the results it produces, especially in the contact department. Again, he's got a lot of time, but at what point do we start to look at Hernandez and say, is that a top 10 guy in the system? I think by the time we update this top 10, that's going to be a question that I might be able to answer. And I hope that the answer is he stays in there, which means he turns things around a little bit. But 35% K rate and 5% walk rate, small sample, it's 26 games, his first stint in low A, but it's not exactly what you want to see from a guy that, looked like he had one of the more advanced swings for a, complex bat, for a DSL bat.
Yeah, Christian Hernandez is super interesting, right? Because in a small sample size, if you break it down into like two different halves, I don't know where the cutoff is, but very different seasons to start off this year, right? Where he started off, and I think he was surprising fans because he wasn't striking out nearly as much as we had expected, right? The swing and miss in the zone was not nearly as problematic as we thought it was going to be, because we know he had those problems down in the Arizona Complex League. And so he came up and it's like, all right, like he may not be producing the best numbers in the entire world, but like he's not swinging and missing at pitches in the zone. And we liked that, right? So like fans were like all on board, didn't matter what he was putting up overall numbers wise. And then something like clicked and he was hitting for more power, but then he was striking out a whole lot more. That's what raised up that strikeout rate. So just you talk about fluid, like nobody is more like fluid in the system in terms of like where does he stand right now? Like what do we think of him? Rather than Christian Hernandez, because I think it's been super, super interesting for him.
And there was a couple swings I saw him take, and I know he dealt with some issues, in terms of you talk about the contact at the complex, but there was a couple swings where he had a ball like 450.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, that looks really good. And then there's other times where he just looks, totally different. And I was looking at, what you were saying, like the first 10 games, he's hitting over 300 with a near 900 OPS and striking out 16% of the time, small sample, but it seems like it's just totally shifted the other way. Now you look at his last 15 games, he's striking out 44% of the time. Mm-hmm. So, again, he's really young, very fluid, but this is a guy where I don't know what to do with him. I don't know. Like that's the best way I can describe it, because obviously the risk is there. Obviously there's some serious questions now about that hit tool, but I don't want to, I hate putting caps on teenage prospects as talented as he is. So it would be one of those situations where someone would have to leapfrog him. I'm not just going to drop him, but if certain guys are performing, maybe outside the top 10, there's a chance where maybe he gets passed up.
Dude, how on earth do you evaluate international free agent signings? Like it seems like every guy, I mean, like we throw it out all the time, like that Hernandez, like unfairly had the Manny Machado, A-Rod, like comps thrown his way, right? It just feels like every year there's about 10 guys that sign that are going to be the next superstar. And it's like, that is not the case. And then you have guys that are signing, you have what seems like the entire Houston Astros rotation that signed for like $5 and then become studs, right? How on earth do you evaluate those guys?
Man, it is so hard. I try as much as I can to ignore the signing bonuses, because I think that it's become abundantly clear that, of course, if you took a census, most of the prospects that pan out were probably more expensive international free agents, but there's so many cheap international free agents who end up being way better. You look at Victor Mesa and Victor Mesa with the Marlins. One signed for $5 million, the other brother signed for $1 million. The $5 million brother might be released to retire relatively soon. The $1 million,
how is he still going to get bats?
I don't know, and right now he's not. I think he's hurt. I can't believe they still give him at bats. And then Mesa Jr., I think, is their best position player prospect in the system. It's him or Khalil Watson. You'll get Ellie De La Cruz, $60,000. Andy Rodriguez, $10,000. Like it is crazy. But I think really that's where you talk about like data versus the eye test. That's where you really got to go deep into the eye test. And that's all we really have is, limited footage and whatever it may be. So usually I try to tread lightly on those guys and wait till I have at least like some DSL information and some DSL video and hopefully some complex video. But it is really hard with the international free agents. But I will say, like, the comps drive me nuts with those kids because it's unfair to them and they're usually silly.
Yeah. While we're on this topic, listeners out there, I'll go and retweet. Mike Ernst posted something related to the international free agent market in the Cubs class. It was the Miguel Amaya and Braylon Marquez class and how wild of a class that was in terms of who has been successful and who is not. I know that I believe that the top IFA from that class was Eddie Julio Rodriguez, who ended up fizzling out, and Braylon Marquez actually got one of like the lower signing bonuses of that class. It's like it's just I'll go retweet that, go check that out. It's worth looking into anything Michael Ernst is tweeting out. But it's crazy, man. It's wild how that works.
It's one of those things too where the whole system is so messed up, and it's what like the more I find out, the more I talk to anybody I can talk to about it on the scouting side of things, I'm like, man, do I not want to ever get involved in that? Like, it is a mess, and there's a lot at play there, but it's one of those things where part of me is like, play the percentages and just sign a bunch of dudes for like 50 to 100 grand. The other part of me is like, but sometimes the best guys are the best guys. So I'm always fascinated by the approach by that. But I will say, like, with these kids, a lot of them are so young and so raw. You can look at the swing and see which guys, have a pretty good chance at translating, at least relatively well to the complex and beyond.
I want to end the show here talking about a few guys that you can kind of define as your favorites in the system. That can be top prospects, just players you dig for. I know we already mentioned Slaughter, but like guys that you dig for whatever reason. I know that like from a Cubs focus, like for the guys that follow basically just the Cubs prospects and dabble in other systems, but like I know that Greg Zumac loves James Triantos. That's his guy. I've in terms of like a deeper cut, Ezekiel Pagan is a guy that has always caught my eye. Jimmy Nelligan always has loved Kevin Mate as he's continued to get better and better and better. Are there guys, whether it's a top prospect, we've talked about guys that you're clearly higher on, but whether it's a top prospect or someone more of a deeper cut that really catches your eye that you really dig?
That's a great question. So Jake Slaughter would have been answer number one. I just think that guy obviously can just play, and doesn't get enough fanfare there. Owen Caissie absolutely is another one. And then I know he's like still a relatively popular name, but I don't think people realize, Cubs fans do, and I was talking about this actually recently, is how Cubs fans are, not even saying that 'cause I'm on a Cubs podcast right now, but I was talking about it with my co-host Jack McMullen on the call up. When it comes to the questions I get, for the call up and just, the DMs and conversations I have, Cubs fans have to be as knowledgeable as any when it comes to prospects. So they rarely have a guy fly under the radar, but I do feel like Jackson Ferris is not getting enough hype or love. And maybe that's just because I'm on the outside. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I'd love to know what the pulse is on Ferris, because this is a 19-year-old kid, high school arm, overslot guy, of course, but he's sitting 94, like sitting, and it's pretty low effort. I think he's way more advanced than I expected. The walks are a little high so far, but in terms of just his mechanics, his delivery, his stuff, I think this is a dude that could explode with one or two little tweaks. Still trying to separate the breaking balls a little bit, and that curveball has been very inconsistent for him in the early going. But again, he's got the four-seamer and he's got a sinker, and four-seamer's 94, 95, sinkers 92, 93. And then he's got the slider and the curveball. Hopefully one of those can kind of, make the leap. And then he's mixed in a changeup a few times. Like, he's got a deep arsenal potentially, and he's just a great athlete on the mound. He's 6'4". I think that there's big upside here with Ferris.
The ride on that fastball, man. The ride on the four seam is good. It's really, really good.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he actually, I think that's a really good example of a guy kind of flying under the radar a little bit. It's funny because I think leading up to the day before his promotion up to Myrtle Beach, very little conversation about Jackson Ferris because I think there were so many unknowns. Because like he's a high school draft pick. Those are the guys we just know the least on, are the high school guys, right?
Of course.
And then he got called up to Myrtle Beach, and it kind of took Cubs Twitter by storm, because that doesn't really happen, right? The Cubs don't really call up high school draft picks from the previous year up to full season ball. Now, I know the whole system has changed over the past few years with the removal of short season ball. I get that. And then since then, we've actually seen Luis Rujano called up, and he was a high school draft pick a year ago. So it's changed, but it was still wild to see him get called up. And I think that Cubs fans like took notice on that. Then he went out later that week after he got called up, made his first career start, and we talked about it on last episode, went out and absolutely shoved in his first start. Absolutely shoved.
Yeah, was it like seven punchies in 3?
Yeah, yep. And like, he looked phenomenal, dude. Like I think it was the first 6 batter, like the first 6 outs were strikeouts. He struck out 1 in his last inning at work. And just Cubs Twitter went wild, dude. They went wild. Yeah. And I love that. And that honestly, that's a great example of like why I love following prospects, right? Is it like a guy that a week prior was hardly being talked about, and now everybody loves Jackson Ferris.
Yeah. Which is what's so fun about it. And then just seeing fans get so excited. I'll give you one more name too, though he's not off to as good of a start as his performance last year, but I still think he's doing pretty well. And just a guy that I think just hits is Darius Hill. Mm-hmm. The swing is not the prettiest in the world, but the guy just makes contact. He sprays the ball all over. Darius Hill is just a really interesting bat to me. I think that guy can find his way to the big leagues and just hit enough to hang around on a bench. And again, like that's a guy that like doesn't even get ranked on top 30 lists. But I think just can hit the baseball. So is a sneaky decent athlete. So that'd probably be the other guy that I like a little bit more than maybe than most is Darius Hill.
Yeah, talk about a high floor when you make that type of contact, or that amount of that amount of contact.
That amount, absolutely.
That brings value by itself,
100%.
All right, man. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to kind of talk about with the Cubs system? Is there anything I left off? Anything that you wanted to bring to the forefront here?
I have a question for you.
Yeah, what's up?
So, what do you feel like, or who do you feel like, or what aspect of the Cubs system do you think is most overlooked by those on the outside? Like, who's someone that I should be clued into a little bit more, or maybe someone that I should have my eyes on as we get ready to do the update for the Cubs system?
I'll give you a player, but first whenever I get this type of question, I love to point out the fact, or like the way in which, and listeners are probably sick of this if you listen to me as guest spots on other shows, but I love to point out the fact that the Cubs have built a system that has talent throughout, right? You look at Myrtle Beach, South Bend, Tennessee, Iowa, and young guys up in Chicago, and there is like starting caliber players on a playoff team at every single level. And that is not something that has been that's not something that's been the case in this organization for nearly 20 years. Even when the Cubs were winning a World Series and in the playoffs every year, that was not the case, right? Everybody was bunched up and everybody was making up Chicago at the exact same time. This system is set up in a way that it is prepared to sustain success at the major league level into the future. And I love the way they've built this organization from the ground up. I think that's phenomenal. That's kind of my first point, I guess, system wide,
Totally. And that's a cool thing is like, I think when you start to have that approach, that consistent approach, and you have that continuity from top to bottom, you can start to follow that mold, and it feels like you just keep reloading and just keep going. And that's what that's what I really like about what they're doing here. Again, every draft, I like what they do. So it seems like the plan is pretty consistent.
And then as far as players go, I'll give you a name, and listeners will not be new to. I think Cubs prospect followers will not be new to this name, because that's somebody that they absolutely love. Moises Ballesteros is a name to watch. I just think that we're talking about Owen Caissie. I always kind of comp Ballesteros to what Caissie does, because the way in which they hit is very similar. Owen Caissie was really, really good and still is at going the opposite way, peppering the left center gap. Ballesteros is the exact same way in that he can use all fields. As a 19-year-old in full season ball, it's been really, really impressive from Ballesteros. He can really tap in the way that, to a lesser extent, the way that Matt Mervis can go out there, like we talked at the very beginning here, and go out there and make solid contact out in front. Ballesteros can tap into that every once in a while. I think he can improve a little bit more. And once he does that, the power is going to really take off. But for me, the most impressive thing about Ballesteros is his ability to limit strikeouts, to draw walks at such a young age. You know, like that's not a normal thing. In addition to the fact that he's a catcher, long term, maybe not a catcher, but like at this point, he is a catcher. I just think the whole package is there, dude. Like to me, Ballesteros is a top 10 prospect in the Cubs system right now.
Yep, you just put me on because I'm looking right now, and I mean the numbers look really, really good. I'm excited to do that video dive because when you're walking more than you strike out and you're putting up EVs over 109 as a 19-year-old, that usually bodes pretty well for, you know, that offensive projection. You know, the guy that I was last thing I'll bring up, the guy I was kind of hoping would make a leap this year that, you know, he's been okay, but I haven't seen the power really shine through is Pinango. I was hoping we'd see something from him. Is that someone that Cubs fans were pretty excited about before? Like, I thought that there was, you know, some big time power potential there, but I don't know.
I'll be honest. I'll be honest. I think I was driving the bandwagon for Pinango. For a while. I think I was driving the bandwagon. And I'm still on Pinango. Just I'm not necessarily driving the bandwagon anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You're not going out of your way to bring him up, but if someone asks, you're still pro Pinango.
What was so impressive?
I see it. Go ahead. I see it too. I do.
Yeah, what was so impressive to me with Pinango was that he went from a guy that was really good at making contact, and like every single hit that he got was down the left field line, going the opposite way. It seemed like at his first year at Myrtle Beach was every hit was the opposite way. It was wild. It was absolutely wild. And then it was a matter of, all right, like, can he now learn how to turn on pitches and get the ball in the air and show off the power? Because that's like the next big step. And he did start to do that to a certain degree, but what hasn't followed behind is his ability to draw walks. And so as he's been pulling the ball in the air a little bit more, the batting average has gone down, and he has to have a high batting average to support his on-base percentage because his OBP is not going to be driven by walks because he refused to take them. You know what I mean? Yeah. He has really strong exit velocities as well, which is why I kind of believed in that power out, like the outbreak of power because of those EVs. But he just hasn't quite put it together. I think with Pinango, another problem is that he is not necessarily strong out in left field or right field, you know?
Yeah, that was something that stood out to me in the video. That didn't look great out there.
Yeah, he just got so much value has to come from the bat, dude. So I worry about that. And so that maybe more than anything, that is why he's dropped down my list, to go along with, like, he just hasn't drawn more walks, to go along to support that OBP, you know?
I'm pretty sure he put up a couple like 113s last year.
Yes.
Though. Like, dude, he is a weird case.
He's super weird, and at this point, like, I'm too scared to like rank him any higher because he's such a strange case. You know,
I'm in the same boat, but it's so weird when you can put up 113s like that as a 20-year-old, and then you're fighting to break 320 in the slugging department so far. Yep. Like, what an interesting case. I'm gonna keep following him though. Yeah, I think he's fascinating.
One more guy for you to follow. I am really excited to see the debut of Ed Howard this year. I think that we're getting closer. I don't think it's quite time yet, but we're getting closer. We talked about Ed on last week's episode, and just everything about Ed Howard has been extraordinarily professional since the day he was drafted. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a guy that I trust in returning from such a freak injury, it would probably be Silk. And I just think that it's going to be huge to see what he does defensively. We've heard reports down from Arizona that he's looking super smooth, as always, over there at shortstop. He's going to come up to South Bend and be in a timeshare at shortstop and second base with Kevin Made because Made is so damn good over there at shortstop. But he was looking way better. The overall results don't show it from 2021 in that small sample size, but he was looking way better at the plate than he was in his in 2022 than he was in 2021. So I'm just really excited to see what he does at the plate. Obviously, he's gonna come back and be a little rusty. That's a given. But I don't think we should entirely write off a former first-round pick so quickly just because of a freak injury. You know what I mean?
And he's 21 still.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And you know, the floor with the glove, the athleticism. Another dude that, yeah, he hits it on the ground a lot, but he hits the ball hard. So
Yeah.
I do agree with that. I'd love to see a little bit more Ed Howard. I have heard a little bit that he's looked great on, you know, swinging it too so far in those like extended games. So I'm very excited. That's going to be a fun one. Him and Made up the middle, like that. That could be one of the better defensive middle infields in the lower levels.
That's wild, man. All right, sorry. One more name since you asked, and I failed to bring him up earlier. I won't go into super detail. Parker Chavers, down in Myrtle Beach.
Yeah.
I dig him, man. I've voiced that on Twitter. I've voiced that on the show. There's just
coastal guy.
Yeah, he's a coastal guy. He's playing in Myrtle Beach, which is where coastal is. Conway, and it's just, to me, that's where like my scout hat comes on, as opposed to like looking into the numbers, because like I just watched Parker Chavers play and there's just something about him, dude. Like, I know he's old for the level. I know he's repeating Myrtle Beach. I know he's had injury problems. I know all that. There's something about Parker Chavers. I've been like, I constantly try to squeeze him in like the 29-30 range of top 30s, because like it's just a name that I feel like people should continue watching.
He's a good athlete too. He was on that Katuitt Kettleers team as well, and so it was him, Mervis, Joe Nahas as well. So a lot of Cubs ties on that team. And Nahas has been throwing it well too. I shared a host family with him. Awesome.
Oh, nice.
Dude. Oh, nice. Such a good dude.
Very cool.
But Parker Chavers, man, he was one of the names that, you know, whenever scouts would show up, you know, they come up to us and they ask us, you know, who's in the lineup today and whatever. And like, it was Nick Gonzalez, Joey Loperfido, Casey Schmidt, Parker Chavers. Like, those were the names that, you know, we were getting asked the most about in the field. And he showed really well, but yeah, then he messed up that shoulder going into that, I think, his last year of college, and just continued to be banged up. But I mean, I saw that guy do some really good things on the Cape. So I think that's a deep name, but I love it. I definitely, I've seen flashes. Like, I don't think you're crazy at all. I've seen those flashes with Wood on the Cape, and you know, that was a guy that would have been I think a top 5 round pick if he didn't get hurt.
Well, I will always re-invite someone who calls me not crazy back onto the show in the future, so be on the lookout for that. You want to go ahead and plug yourself, just all the work that you guys are, all the good, terrific work you guys are doing over at Just Baseball, over at the Call Up Pod. Like, go ahead and send all the plugs out for yourself.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. So yeah, we have the Call Up podcast for the prospect folks out there. That's hosted by me and Jack McMullen, AAA broadcaster for the Indianapolis Indians. Have a lot of fun doing that with him. The Just Baseball show is a lot of fun. We're covering Major League Baseball in its entirety. Every Monday we got Walker Buehler on, and you know, he provides some awesome insight as well. And then check out the website, justbaseball.com. We are churning out tons of articles every day across the league, so plenty on the Cubs as well. And from the big leagues, prospects, fantasy, everything you need over there at justbaseball.com. So, Greg, really appreciate the time, man.
Yeah, thanks, dude. I really appreciate you coming on. Listeners out there, be sure to leave a rating and review, a comment on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube, on any podcast platform, all that good stuff. We really appreciate the ratings and the comments and stuff like that. Like I said, I'll always try to respond on YouTube. If you guys think that we're crazy on anything we're saying here, we always invite stuff like that. So in the meantime, we'll be back soon. Next week is an episode with the Iowa Cubs broadcaster, Alex Cohen. So we'll be back with that in one short week. Thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you soon.